all are hearing my voice and seeing me in the slide on the screen. We are honored to have this conversation today. We've had over 500 folks register interested in receiving the recording or participating today, which is really exciting for Maine philanthropy and for the message of tribal sovereignty. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box so that folks have a sense of who they are participating today with, if you can. My name is Jeanette Andre, and I'm the president and CEO of Maine Philanthropy Center. I am a multiracial woman. I'm Filipina and white, and with dark brown hair, glasses, and red lipstick. Maine Philanthropy Center's mission is to provide opportunity, leadership, and support to advance the effectiveness of philanthropy in Maine and its ability to make a meaningful difference. And the way that we do that is we collaborate to create a vibrant, just, and equitable Maine. We are an organization of foundations, corporate, private, public, family, community, you name it, nonprofits, individuals, and other philanthropic practitioners. And Maine is the epicenter of our work, and we come together to build relationships, deepen knowledge, and move resources. Our diverse membership is our strength, allowing us to facilitate cross-sector collaboration, create shared understanding, dismantle ineffective silos, and shift power to ensure that Maine is a leader in advancing equity. And we do all of this through centering equity in everything that we do. I'm showing you the agenda for today. First, we'll start with a grounding. We'll do some welcome and introductions. We will have the presentation by Dr. Kalt, Joe, as he insists on being called, question and answer, and a close with some calls to action. I've already asked you to introduce yourself to in the chat box, but if folks haven't heard that yet, to please do that. We have a Q&A function that is available in the Zoom on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use that to ask questions. Things tend to get lost in the chat. So you can use the chat to converse with each other and to +1 all of the great stuff that you're going to hear today. This session is being recorded. You should have gotten a notification for that, and we will make it available. There will also be closed captioning. So if you'd like to see those, you can turn those on through your Zoom menu. For virtual spaces, MPC has asked folks to abide by our community agreements, and Robert will be linking those in the chat box. So please take some time to look at that. And finally, if you do need tech support or support throughout the meeting, Robert has renamed himself Support. So please reach out to him directly and you can get the help that you need, hopefully. This is our second time, I believe, doing a webinar. So there's going to be, might be a little bit of learning, but appreciate your patience and grace with that. I would like to welcome my colleague, Sarah Lentz, to help us ground us in this conversation today.
Thank you, Jeanette. And as you heard Jeanette do at the top of this session, she did a kind of like a visual description of herself for people who might be blind or have vision impairment. So I also would like to do that. So my name is Sarah Lentz. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm an employee of the Maine Philanthropy Center, and I am a white woman with clear glasses and long brown hair, and I have a blurred background this morning. I just wanted to take a moment to welcome us all into this space. And so I really invite everyone to do what they need to do to be able to be present in this space. So I invite you to turn your phones over. I invite you to close other tabs on your screen and kind of just land here in this space with each other. We're almost 200 strong, coming in from all across the country. And I just invite you to close your eyes and take a couple of deep breaths. To really just land here in this space. And for those of you that are here in Maine, I ask you to, well, all of you, I ask you to push your feet down into the ground and to feel the support beneath you, the land beneath you, the land of the Wabanaki, which is unceded land. And I just invite you to check in with yourself for any points of tension, anxiety, excitement, and just really allow yourself to be here fully as we listen to this research and and the impact of this research together as a group of people who can really make a difference around this. And with that, I ask you to take one more deep breath. And when you're ready, come back to this space. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeanette.
Thank you, Sarah. I just wanted to start out by providing a little bit of context before we move into the presentation by Dr. Kalt. First and foremost, I want to be clear that Maine Philanthropy Center supports the recognition of the inherent sovereignty and self-determination of the tribes in Maine. This support is guided by our commitment to equity and our understanding of the role that philanthropy has and can play in advancing social justice and civil rights. We believe that recognizing the inherent sovereignty of the tribes in Maine is a civil rights issue. Last year, we released a letter of support fully outlining our position, and I encourage you to take a look at that. And I think Robert will put that in the chat. We are pleased today to host this conversation with Dr. Kalt, Joe. You will hear more about him in just a bit, but he is one of the co-authors of the paper, The Economic and Social Impacts of Restrictions on the Applicability of Federal Indian Policies to the Wabanaki Nations in Maine, or as we will simply refer to it going forward as the Harvard Report. This report outlines how the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980 has stifled the economic and social growth for tribal and non-tribal citizens in Maine and has left out the tribes in Maine from historic and exponential growth other tribes in Indian country have benefited from. The report outlines clearly what is at stake for the tribes in Maine, tribal citizens and non-tribal citizens. It tells the story of potential yet unrealized and of the real and harmful social and economic impacts this unique state relationship has had. We are pleased and honored to host this conversation and hope that you can see yourself in this work. Before we move into the report and the findings with Joe, I want to recognize that this conversation has been made possible through partnership. First, through the extraordinary partnership of the Wabanaki Alliance, and then through our co-sponsors who have generously offered to share this session with their networks. It truly would not have been made possible without the support of the Wabanaki Alliance, and I would like to invite John Diefenbach-Krall to share a few words. I'm sorry, Diefenbacher-Krall to share a few words about the work of the Alliance and to introduce Dr. Kalt.
Morning. I am John Diefenbacher-Krall. I'm male, white, 60 years old, gray hair, wearing a blue fine checked shirt. The Wabanaki Alliance thanks the Maine Philanthropy Center for creating this event and partnering with us to present another opportunity for people to hear Dr. Joseph Kalt discuss the report he co-authored last year, The Economic and Social Impacts of Restrictions on the Applicability of Federal Indian Policies to the Wabanaki Nations in Maine. For people unfamiliar with the Wabanaki Alliance, we were created in the late spring of 2020 by the 4 Wabanaki Nations, the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Passamaquoddy Tribe, and the Penobscot Nation. These nations, representing 5 Wabanaki communities, united to form a nonprofit organization that can educate and advocate about Wabanaki inherent sovereignty. Wabanaki is a term for the original peoples and nations extending from southern New England into several Canadian provinces. Inherent sovereignty describes all the governmental powers we generally associate and recognize as wielded by original nations. These powers of self-determination have been part of original nations and peoples since they came into existence. They have not been conferred by any settler governments. The Wabanaki Alliance is involved in an all-out effort to have settler governments, institutions, and people recognize Wabanaki inherent sovereignty. If you've not already done so, I encourage you to visit the Wabanaki Alliance website and follow us on the social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to find out more about us. Last year, the Wabanaki Alliance asked the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development to examine the impact that the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act has had on Wabanaki communities, and the state of Maine. The report Joe co-authored describes what the Harvard team found. It documents the devastating economic impacts on Wabanaki communities and the Maine communities surrounding them, and should be read in conjunction with the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission's finding that the Settlement Act and the companion Maine Implementing Act are in serious nonconformance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, both in the process leading up to their enactment and in how they have been implemented. The acts have created structural inequities that have resulted in conditions that have risen to the level of human rights violations. Dr. Kalt is the Ford Foundation Professor Emeritus of an International Political Economy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. In 1987, he co-founded with Stephen Cornell the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. Professor Kalt is Vice Chairman of the Board of the White Mountain Apache Tribe's Fort Apache Heritage Foundation, a member of the board of the Sonoran Institute, and has served on the board of directors of the Native Governance Center. He has also served on the Navajo Nations President's Council of Economic Advisors, is on the advisory board of the Chickasaw Nations Community Development Entity, and has provided advice and counsel to numerous U.S. tribes and tribal organizations, as well as indigenous communities in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. An expert in antitrust and regulatory economics, Professor Kalt served as a senior economist with Compass Lexicon Consulting and its predecessors for more than 25 years before stepping down in 2019. Dr. Kalt.
Thank you, John. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Well, thank you very much to all of you. As John just mentioned, my name is Joe Kalt. I'm a professor at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm an old white guy with a little bit of white hair left. And you're seeing in my background my office in Tucson, Arizona. As you all are aware, we released a study in December examining the effects of the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act on the Wabanaki Nations in Maine, and in particular focused on the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act's restrictions on the applicability of federal policies in Maine. These federal policies, for more than 40 years now, have provided substantial powers of self-determination through self-governance to tribes elsewhere in the United States. But those policies and their applicability have been fundamentally blocked and impeded in the state of Maine. A word about this study, as John indicated, the study, we were asked to do this study by the Wabanaki Alliance, which, as John described, was formed by as an association of the tribal governments of the Wabanaki Nations in Maine. It's indicative of the situation that you all face in Maine, that we have caught some flack for taking money from the Wabanaki Nations. We find this to be indicative of the situation that you face, because in that flack is a problem of institutional racism. At the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, we're a school of government. We routinely, as does much of Harvard University, receive funding for research from governments. And so, for example, if the Harvard Business School takes funding from the state of Massachusetts gambling business called the state lottery, no one thinks anything of that because it's a government, state government. But people question when research is funded by tribal governments. Why is that? I think it's fundamentally, as I say, an aspect of institutional racism. That is, we are all taught in grade school and so forth about the United States being a federation of 50 states and so forth and so on, but very few of us are taught that in fact in the United States we have a federal government, 50 states, and 574 federally recognized tribal governments. the failure to understand the powers and even existence of tribal government is a fundamental problem that all Indian tribes face, and that we certainly find arising, that lack of understanding arising often in the state of Maine. So what did we find in our work? Let me move to the results. As I've mentioned, MICSA, the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act, blocks the full application of federal self-determination policy in Maine. Compared to non-Maine tribes, all 4 Wabanaki nations lagged severely in economic development. MICSA, we find, is the central cause of Wabanaki's underdevelopment. Not only their economic underdevelopment, but their institutional underdevelopment, the social strains and cultural strains that the Wabanakis experience. Wabanaki development, we find, would benefit Maine's Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki citizens. In other words, this restriction, we're finding that these restrictions on the application of self-determination policy in Maine is not only hurting the Wabanakis, but hurting non-Wabanaki citizens of Maine as well. The obvious policy implication is that removing these restrictions would benefit all of the citizens of Maine, a win-win for Wabanakis and non-Wabanakis alike. Let me give you a tiny bit of background. I spent 35 years, more than that, doing this, and so it's hard for me to be short when I do this, but we've been looking at this for decades. In the mid-1970s, under President Nixon, a federal presidential proclamation was issued that sought to change the overall tenor of federal policy in Indian country. Indian country, by the way, is a term of art that tribes use to describe the 574 federally recognized tribes. The presidential proclamation in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, basically said that federal policies of trying to run everything on reservations was in fact a cause of the poverty that was so widespread and had left American Indians living on reservations as the poorest identifiable group in the United States as of the early 1970s. And the new policy was designed to say, let's give tribes a chance to run their own affairs. The early years of this policy were not very effective. In late 1980s, 1988, specifically in 89, amendments to this federal policy resulted in greatly expanded powers of local self-government on the part of tribes. And so outside of the state of Maine, what we find is hundreds of tribal governments are essentially performing all of the functions that we would normally expect of any state or local government, running their own taxes, their own police forces, their own fire departments, their own court systems, their own housing departments, their own road paving departments, their own water and sewer departments, their own parks and recreation, their own public health programs, and so forth. These policies of self-determination, we find, have produced a 30-year economic boom. Since those amendments in the late 1980s, there's been an economic boom going on in Indian country outside of the state of Maine. Outside of the state of Maine, since those amendments of 1989 to the federal policy, Indian incomes on reservations have grown 3.5 times faster than the United States as a whole. People don't understand this. People see, particularly you in Maine, see the poverty of the tribes. But in fact, outside of Maine, what we're witnessing is an economic boom. It's not uniform, it's not everywhere, but here is what the boom looks like outside of Maine. In this picture, I'm showing you in the graph at the bottom, the line there in red, all people in the United States, just an average of all the people in the United States per capita, per person income in the United States. And what we can see is during this era of self-government in Indian country that began with the self-government amendments of 88 and 89, for the average American, income adjusted for inflation has grown 17%. That's actually very slow. That's less than 2% a year, less than 1% a year. It's less than 0.5% a year. And it's part of the problem that we see across the United States in the much discussed, stagnation of the middle class and so forth. We've had slow economic growth in the United States. Economic growth isn't the be all and end all of life. But I can tell you that for Indian tribes, it's been a critical thing, because economic growth or its absence is what determines whether people have food on the table often, whether they have a roof, or at least a non-leaking roof overhead, whether their schools have good equipment, whether the roads are being paved, whether the trash is being collected. Well, what's happened to American Indians living on reservations? Here is the data that I'll show you. I've talked about this economic boom. Here is what happens outside of the state of Maine for the average American Indian living on an Indian reservation outside of the state of Maine. That is what has happened. 61% growth in personal income, per capita income, outside of the state of Maine. This is a revolution, because for decades and decades, and in some cases more than a century, the ruling condition on an American Indian reservation has been one of poverty. There is still poverty across Indian country. I don't want to leave an impression that everyone is doing fantastically well. But what's happening on average, so it means across 570 reservations, excluding the 4 tribes in Maine, you're seeing this very strong economic growth in Indian country. This economic growth has been has had a dramatic impact on poverty. What the data on this slide right now shows you families with children living in poverty. Indian country, that is the tribes, versus the United States as a whole. And in this data, in this box I've just drawn you, AIAN, you see the label on the far left, that's the US Census code for American Indian Alaska Native. And what you can see is poverty, for example, in 1969. This is the poverty that prompted the Nixon administration to issue that proclamation and begin to change that proclamation and begin to change federal policy. More than half of all families with children in Indian country were living in poverty. But over time, as you move across in that little box there for American Indians on reservations, you can see the dramatic decrease in poverty rates across Indian country. And in fact, by the latest census data we have for 2020, that poverty rate is now at 23.4%. And so what you're seeing here is poverty being cut more than in half. You can see in the numbers above that, you don't have to look at all the numbers, but it's been very sticky for poverty rates have been very sticky for the rest of the United States. And it is now the case in 2020 that American Indians living on reservations are no longer the poorest identifiable group in the United States. We've done a little calculation. If poverty had stayed in its rate as in 1989, where you see 47.3% of families with children living in poverty on Indian reservations, if poverty had stayed there and we had not had this economic boom, there would be about 600,000 more American Indian children growing up in poverty than there are today. So this is quite a dramatic improvement in the lives of families on reservations. Why this strong economic growth outside of Maine? The easy thing for people to think about is it's all about casinos. All those tribes all across the United States have casinos. That conception is wrong. It's not all about gaming. We have data in the first decade of casinos, which the federal law that changed in the late 1980s ushered in this casino revolution for many tribes. We have data on those tribes, but we also have data in the first decade of the gaming revolution on tribes without casinos, non-gaming tribes. It turns out in that first decade of the 1990s, about half the tribes got put in casinos or other gaming operations, and about half the tribes did not. What you see on the chart right now is the growth in, again, that inflation-adjusted, real, in other words, real spending power per capita income, per person income. In that decade of the 1990s, for the average American, the average citizen of the United States, their income grew 11%, about 1% a year, over the decade of the 1990s. And that's what you see on the chart. Here is the data. Here is the data for the gaming tribes. No one finds it particularly surprising. Yes, there was a casino boom. And what we find is that gaming tribes grew a little bit more than 3 times faster in terms of people's per person income for tribal citizens in that first decade of gaming. What shocks everybody, what people don't understand, is that the non-gaming tribes, shown here on the left, the non-gaming tribes also grew about 3 times faster than the United States in terms of their economic conditions. And so we have other data, and if you go around Indian country, the reason that it's not all about casinos is twofold. For many tribes, they're in very, very rural areas. And the casino consists of a house trailer with a couple of slot machines trying to stop truck drivers on their way through town and catch their quarters. To be successful in this game of gaming, one needs to live near a whole bunch of human beings. And when that's not the case, then the gaming provides a little free cash sometimes, but is not very important. And most tribes are, in fact, of course, very, very rural. The second thing about the gaming revolution is that tribal casinos are merely a manifestation of tribal powers of self-governance. So tribes have their gaming businesses, their casinos, but state governments have their gaming businesses, usually called lotteries. So in the state of Massachusetts, where Harvard University is, the state of Massachusetts has the most successful state-run gaming business, a lottery, in the United States in terms of the number of citizens who play the lottery in Massachusetts. But in Indian country, self-government opened up many more opportunities for the tribes. And so today we see a very diverse economy emerging across Indian country with hotels, restaurants, golf courses, bowling alleys, museums, construction firms. You see in the bottom bullet there, distilleries. The distillery one is interesting. There's a tribe who has a distillery, and it made the national news early in the COVID epidemic because you all remember the shortages of hand sanitizer. That hand sanitizer is made in distilleries in this Indian tribe was the first to be able to convert to making hand sanitizer and help alleviate the nation's shortage of hand sanitizer. But tribes have farms and fish processing plants, banks, grocery stores, on and on. The tribal economies are increasingly diversified outside of the state of Maine with the kinds of activities I'm listing here. Interestingly, and importantly, probably for the tribes in Maine, we can talk about this later, many tribes, particularly smaller tribes in rural areas, are emerging. I mentioned tribes performing all the functions of state and local governments. Many tribes are emerging, essentially running municipalities, running themselves as municipalities, providing all the local services from health clinics to street lighting to trash collection and so forth, and earning revenue off of that. And becoming economic anchors within their regions, not just for the tribal community, but for the broader communities in which tribal reservations are embedded. And so we're more and more seeing these self-governing tribes, particularly in rural areas, being the economic and public service anchors of entire regions. Some people have asked, well, in fact, we catch this in we've been talking to lots of groups in Maine, such as this organization today. The reason the Maine tribes aren't developing is they haven't had access to federal spending. That's actually not the issue. When we look across the rest of the United States, it's not federal spending itself that generates economic development. In fact, what we're finding is that tribes are increasingly fiscally independent. Through our research in another context, we were able to get data on 23 tribes in the state of Washington immediately prior to the pandemic and look at their budgets. And these tribes the state of Washington has been a bit of a leader in this self-governance movement across Indian country. And here you see the data on how those tribes government budgets are constructed, if you will. And what you see is that the vast majority of these tribes, tribal revenues are from self-government. That is, they're either tribal taxes, leases, forestry stumpage, and so forth, or business earnings off gaming, non-gaming, and other enterprises. And the federal portion, and federal plus state portion of these tribal budgets, that is getting money from the federal government or the federal government and the states, is a relatively small proportion of the budgets of the self-governing tribes. We also have data. We run a big program at Harvard called Honoring Nations, which tries to recognize and disseminate results on best practices among tribal governments, what's working and what's not working. And here's data on 925 high-performing, quite successful tribal government programs. And I'll just briefly show you and not dwell on it too much, but I've drawn a circle here around the federal portion of these programs' budgets. And what you can see is numbers 35, 33%, something like that. So the tribes do utilize federal monies. Importantly, in the Maine General Fund, more than 34% of Maine's state budget comes from the federal government. The federal government supports state governments and tribal governments. We live in a world of both state and tribal governments. But we do not find that economic development is somehow being spurred by federal spending across Indian country. What we do find is I've already suggested, and you can hear in my remarks already, it is all about, or at least mostly about, the federal policy shift to self-government. That is what is the source of the very strong economic growth outside of the state of Maine. Simply turning the powers of local self-rule over to the tribes has been the key to the economic boom going on across the rest outside of Maine, Indian country. And any of you are interested, you can go to our website or email me, and I can provide citations to all of this. But we've done a lot of research over the years and looked at the effects of tribal self-government, policies of federal policies of self-government. And what we find, for example, is that tribes that took over their timber operations on their reservations produced higher prices per log, greater income, and higher productivity. They got more out of their forests, both financially and quantity-wise, without, and this is important, without destroying their forests. In other words, without, those of you who are into forestry, without, for example, raising the allowable cut, as it's called. In fact, what we find is the tribes are better stewards of their forest and wildlife resources than the state governments or the federal government. We have data on that. We find that tribes that took over their healthcare produce shorter waiting times and higher patient satisfaction. Waiting times, an objective measure, patient satisfaction, a subjective measure. Tribes that took over financial management produce much higher rates of return on any funds that they had. You may think that, well, what's so great about that? Well, it turns out when you're very poor, getting a higher return on your funds allows you to do more. It allows you to build the new school, to pave the highway, to put in the new solid waste facility or whatever your community may need. We find that tribes that took over housing had units that were more solvent and in better repair. Tribes that took over education improved scores and graduation rates. When I say take over, what these policies have allowed tribes to do is take over previously predominantly federally run programs on reservations. And so literally we have places where on Tuesday, the tribal fire department or health clinic is being run by the federal government, and the employees are employees of the federal government. On Wednesday, the tribe takes over and it runs the fire department or the health clinic or the police department or whatever it might be. Often with the same people, no change, but we see these dramatic improvements in performance. We think it is deeply because you have better accountability when the local decision makers are making the decisions over how you run your housing department, over how you run your health clinic, over how you run your schools. There isn't perfection out there. If one can find me a perfect government, please bring it to me. That's our job at the Kennedy School of Government. There's not perfection out there, but we find that the improved accountability by shifting accountability to local decision makers, the local tribal government officials, is dramatically improving performance. And in the economic arena, this shows up dramatically. The event of prior to the late 1980s, there was, as I said, this sort of very uniform poverty across Indian country that had gone on for decades and decades. And then you see this boom take off that I showed you earlier. But we also have cases in Canada and Alaska where these policies of self-government have not been put in place. And we find the tremendous poverty persisting in those places. So all of this is telling us that it has been the federal policies of self-determination through self-government that have been the key to bringing economic improvement and hence improvement in all of these areas, from environmental regulation and health to education and housing for American Indians living on reservations. What's happened in Maine? What's happened in Maine? The Wabanakis have not been keeping up. Here's that data I showed you a few moments ago with that 61% growth in per capita income across the rest of the United States, outside of the lower 48 states, outside of the state of Maine. Here is what has happened to the Wabanakis. This is shocking. When we first started this research, we work with 574 tribes. To be honest with you, we'd done a little bit of work at one time with the Passamaquoddies and stuff, but we never looked systematically at what was going on in terms of economic development in Maine relative to the rest of the United States. And this was one of these instances where this is just straight United States Census data. We don't have to massage it or do anything to it. It's just the straight United States Census data. This was one of these cases where, okay, if we're so smart and our research prior to this was on target and was saying that self-government was the key to the economic boom across the rest of Indian country, and if the Maine tribes didn't have those powers of local self-government because of the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, we ought to find that those Maine tribes would be lagging behind economically. You push the button on the computer and hit the data that you see on your screen is what pops up. We find only a 9% growth in average income for Wabanaki citizens living on the reservations. This is a dramatic reduction in growth relative to the other tribes in the United States. How do the Maine tribes compare to the rest of Maine? I showed you the data for the other 48 states, lower 48 states outside of Maine. I showed you the poverty being cut more than in half under self-determination. Here's what you see in Maine. What you see is the persistence of poverty. Whereas elsewhere in the United States, we increasingly work with places, for example, where standards of living are higher on the reservation than off the reservation in the state. Here's what's going on in Maine. Here is per person income, just to focus on one of the statistics for AIAN, American Indians, Alaska Natives living in the state of Maine, and within these tribal communities. And what you see is very low rates of personal income, particularly compared to the state of Maine, where we see basically the tribal citizens in these tribal communities in Maine, Wabanaki communities in Maine, have personal incomes that are typically half or less than half of that of the average Mainer as of the data in the 2019 census. Child poverty rates in the state of Maine has relatively high poverty compared to the average for the United States, where those numbers are a little bit lower. But the state of Maine, 15%, 15.1% child poverty rates, that is families with children living in poverty. But here you see for the state of Maine, these dramatic poverty rates ranging as high as almost 77% of the families living in poverty. So you see this lack of economic development compared where we've seen those poverty rates cut in the rest of the United States for tribes, that is not happening and has not happened in the state of Maine. Some people have said to us, well, maybe it's just that the state of Maine isn't doing very well. The state of Maine isn't doing well. And that's true. The state of Maine, in terms of income levels, has not been at the upper echelon of the U.S. states. But in fact, when we look at economic growth across the rest of the United States, I showed you this earlier, that was that 17% growth in per person income elsewhere in the United States. What happened in the state of Maine over this era of tribal self-determination? Maine actually has been growing faster than the rest of the United States. Maine is catching up, in fact, with the rest of the United States in terms of the levels of people's income by growing faster. But it's not been the state of Maine's economy that's held back the Wabanaki Nations. What we conclude is that what has held back the Wabanaki Nations is the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. Now, you might be thinking, and we find this in Maine, I spent a week, the Wabanaki Alliance, thank you for hosting me, John. I spent a week in Maine a couple of weeks ago, talking to the state legislature, talking to groups such as many of you. What I found was a lot of Mainers, even if you are predisposed to want to support the Wabanakis and their sovereignty, actually don't really believe that we could break this cycle of poverty that we see in these tribal communities in Maine. I've said to people in Maine, I wish I could take you all on one of our trips out to Indian Country, take you on a field trip to let you see what we see across the other 574 tribes, or at least the 310 tribes outside of the state of Maine. What I'm showing you now is the following. It's kind of reasonable to think, well, you know, these Maine tribes are really rural. They're not near big metropolitan areas. I mean, I work with tribes in Southern California, for example, where they're near essentially the Los Angeles, San Diego metroplex with, you know, millions and tens of millions of people. And it turns out that economic development is generally easier when you're near big markets. You have more opportunities, et cetera. Ruralness does tend to hold down economic development. There's no question about it. And the Maine tribes are also small, and you may be thinking, well, small tribe, how do they get economic development going in these small rural communities? What you're seeing on the screen right now is we've adjusted the data for other tribes, the little gray dots on your screen, for their degree of ruralness measured by the population within 100 miles of them. That's along the bottom axis of this graph. And their size is measured by the total number of employees that they have. You can see the upward slope is telling you basically as you get away from ruralness toward bigger population centers, economic development tends to improve. And we see tribes able to support more employees. What is striking, however, and here you see the little blue dots on the graph, what is striking, however, is that all of the Maine tribal communities, 4 tribes, 5 communities, all of the Maine communities lie very much toward the bottom of the barrel economically in terms of their ability to support, for example, jobs. And that's what we're measuring on the vertical axis is total full-time equivalent FTEs, employees. So this is kind of shocking if you think about it from a research perspective. You might have expected, well, relative to their peers, and you know, looking vertically, you're looking at peers who are relatively small and not close to big metropolitan areas. Relative to their peers, maybe some of the Maine tribes would be doing well, some would be doing poorly, but what we find is all 4 of them are doing poorly. What is it that these 4 tribes share? What they share is MICSA. What they share is the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. Under that act, unless the Wabanakis are explicitly included by Congress, Maine can block the application of federal policies after the adoption of MICSA in 1980 if those federal policies, and the phrase in the law is affect or preempt, pretty vague terms, Maine's jurisdiction. This affects or preempts language has given the state of Maine government a de facto veto power over the application of federal policies in the state of Maine. In a study done, I believe, for the Maine legislature, covering 1980, that is the start of MICSA in 1980, all the way through 2019 when the study was completed. There were 151 pieces of federal legislation. Not a single one of those included language that would explicitly include Wabanakis under those federal policies. Again, giving the state of Maine governments this low-cost veto power over state rule. The consequence of this is stunted development of the Wabanaki tribal governments. The uncertainty, the cost of conflict, the cost of expensive litigation means that the Wabanaki Nations have to be hesitant in going forward with initiatives that many other tribes across the rest of the United States can readily adopt. Just to give you one example, Holtamalacy, for example, do not have a tribal court. It turns out that tribal courts are critical to economic development. They are our #1 statistical predictor of whether a reservation support jobs, is whether you have an independent tribal court. The state of Holtamalacy have to go to the state of Maine, and they're still trying to get a tribal court. The constant threat and actual conflict creates these barriers to the development of the Wabanaki governments. The impact of this is essentially often invisible. What it means is, for example, and I'm thinking of an actual example, a woman that I know, at the age of 24, she's the assistant housing director. At the age of 34, she's the housing director. At the age of 44, she's tribal chair. You're not seeing that kind of development of the human capacity within the Wabanaki communities because of the stunted development and the impediments that are placed by MICSA and the state of Maine. So the result is underdeveloped tribal governments. The impediment is, as I said, not the fact that the tribes don't have access to federal funding. They can get federal funding pretty well. It's the stunted development of tribal government that is limiting the ability of the tribes in Maine, to develop their tribal governments and their economies. I will jump a little bit ahead here. I said I'd like to take you all on a field trip because many of you, I'm guessing, or at least many of the people I've spoken to in Maine, even people who are predisposed to want to support tribal sovereignty, tribal self-government for the Wabanaki Nations, there's still this in the back of a lot of Mainers' minds. Wait a minute, all we've ever seen is this rural poverty among our tribes in the state of Maine. I'll take you quickly on a field trip down to the state of Mississippi, to a tribe, Mississippi Choctaw. This is some of you, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Trail of Tears. President Andrew Jackson forcing the tribes in the southeastern United States on a forced march across the southeast to what is now the state of Oklahoma. Horrendous genocidal effort on the part of the United States government, which resulted in the loss of lives and, of course, the destruction of communities. The Mississippi Choctaw are the Choctaws who hid out from President Andrew Jackson and the federal government for more than a century. They lived in the swamps and pine forests of central Mississippi, not exactly resource rich, very rural. And at the dawn of the self-determination era, would be the last place in the world you would expect economic development. Very low levels of education, rural, lack of natural resources, and so forth. Here is Mississippi Choctaw today, because it's a weekday, and I've been there and seen this. There was a traffic jam this morning as thousands of white and black workers went onto the Mississippi Choctaw Reservation for their jobs. What do? Well, they work in tribal government, but they also work in tribal enterprises owned by the tribe. Their biggest enterprise is called Choctaw. You can hear the word Choctaw in there, Choctaw Enterprises. And I'm old enough to remember the movie The Graduate, and a famous line in the movie The Graduate: "Plastics, my boy, plastics." This tribe went into plastics manufacturing. And you may think that, oh my gosh, plastics, evil and all that. But what are you going to do? Well, what they do is they build, for example, if for a long time, now there's more competition. Plastic forks and spoons at McDonald's and Wendy's in the Eastern United States you were probably using a Choctaw product. Their biggest customers have been Ford and General Motors. Most of the inside of our automobiles, if you look around, are plastic. They've been major manufacturers for Ford and General Motors in vehicle manufacturing. There's some of their stamping operations. This tribe, it's not all about economic development. It's about sovereignty. They'll say that they want sovereignty so they can have freedom to make their own decisions. And I show you the picture here on the upper right of healthcare workers at Mississippi Choctaw. This tribe holds, we've got this documented, we think it's probably a world record. In 15 years, under tribal self-determination from 1985 through 2000, or 1986 through 2001, in 15 years, this tribe raised life expectancy among Choctaws 20 years. This is astounding. In other words, in a 15-year period, you raised the life expectancy of the average Choctaw citizen 20 years. What did they do? They took their economic development and plowed it back into the community, not only into healthcare, but into many other services that have improved lives among the Mississippi Choctaw. In the process, they have strengthened their culture. This is one of the tribes in the United States where we are seeing language recovery with the youth, people 18 and under, having higher rates of native language use than their parents and grandparents. They are recovering language. Real quickly, another quick tour of a tribe in Oklahoma, the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. The Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the photo on the slide right now, is a picture of the entire nation in the late 1970s. They had 2.5 acres of land, $500 in the bank, and the house trailer in that picture. The chairman of the tribe likes to joke that the 3 cars in front of the house trailer are the 3 worst cars ever made in America: a Ford Pinto, Dodge Dart, and an AMC Gremlin. This is a tribe that had been cast to the winds, literally, by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, where their citizens picked up and left, as did many other people in Oklahoma. And the conditions in the late 1970s are as I've described. Here is this tribe today. This tribe is the largest employer in the Shawnee, Oklahoma area, providing jobs, not only in economic enterprises, but in their tribal government. They own the First National Bank and Trust Company in Oklahoma, with branches all over the state of Oklahoma, where most of their customers have no idea that their bank is owned by an Indian tribe. They own the equivalent of a Sam's Club or Costco food store, which is huge. They vertically integrate their own agricultural enterprises, farms and ranches, into this food operation. They recently bought a train, a railroad that links the Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. It creates employment and smooths out a lot of the nation's economic flow of goods, because this link that they bought was very critical and was otherwise defunct. They've rebuilt it. They too have plowed their economic well-being back into the community, and in the process have rebuilt their culture. And so that this tribe now, with their citizens historically spread across the United States by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, now coming back and rekindling tribal ceremonies that had been long lost. A tribe that in the late 1970s you never would have predicted would be in this position. You might think I'm cherry picking by showing you Citizen Potawatomi and Choctaw, but remember, it must be happening in a lot of places to be driving that average growth of people's incomes across Indian reservations up by 61% since 1989. I wanted to give you some sense of, and I won't pause here very long. I wanted to give you some sense. Don't try to read all this. What I want you to realize is I have long lists. These are the laws and regulations that the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the one I showed you, owning the railroad and the bank and the grocery store and all of that. Election codes, criminal codes, disaster management plans, alcohol and tobacco regulations, labor and employment codes, domestic violence codes, land use codes. Here are their legal, health, and other services, health aides, elder care, child development, emergency home repair, on and on. Here's their career and financial services, helping people get jobs and start businesses, zoning and land use regulation, down payment assistance, student housing support, free transportation for students and job seekers. My point being here, this is what a thick, developed tribal government. What you should be struck at is this the kind of list you would expect any good size municipality, city, or state certainly to have. And this is what that has been lacking for the Wabanaki Nations. What's at stake for the Wabanaki Nations and for the state of Maine? What if we were able to close the gap? In other words, the solid line through that picture of the gray dots that I showed you before was the average for tribes of similar situations, peer tribes, if you will. If the Wabanaki Nations had full self-governing powers, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to go to the average. Some of them we would expect to be above average, some would be below. But to get a handle on what's at stake here, we asked the question, what if we were able to close the gap for each of the tribes in Maine so that they had employment levels that were at least at the average of their peers. And those are the little red numbers you see above each tribe. Overall, what we find is that if the Maine tribes in Maine were able to close the gap and just perform at the average of their peers elsewhere in the lower 48 states, there would be about support by the Wabanaki Nations of about 1,400 more jobs in the state of Maine directly. I've been in Maine, of course, I lived in Massachusetts forever, at least had some contact fairly frequently with Maine. 1,400 jobs isn't a huge amount of jobs, but in the local communities, in the counties, for example, where the Wabanaki Nations are located, these are very impactful. And in fact, our data show that if the Maine tribes were just to perform at the average of their peers in the rest of the United States, you would be moving the Maine tribes up to typically the number 1 or number 2 employer in Lincoln County, Washington County, and so forth. These are substantial impacts within those local communities. What would happen? What's the impact of that on the state of Maine as a whole? Those workers go and spend money out in the local communities. They buy groceries, they pay taxes, and so forth. What we find is that if the Maine tribes were to close the gap and just perform at the average of their peers in the rest of the lower 48 states, it would account for about $330 million a year in additional GDP, gross domestic product, for the state of Maine. This is for Maine citizens, Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki. Those tribal jobs, those 1,400 tribal jobs, create spillover jobs because the worker for the tribe goes out and spends money at the grocery store, at the auto repair shop, and so forth. And if we look at how many total jobs, both directly employed by the Wabanaki Nations or spillover jobs at the auto dealer, or the auto mechanics, wherever it is, what would happen in the job situation? We'd find there'd be about 2,700 more jobs supported if the Maine tribes in Maine were to close this employment gap. Importantly, the vast majority of jobs supported would be non-Indian jobs. This is true all over Indian America. The data show us is somewhere typically around 15% of the jobs supported by these booming tribes are tribal citizen jobs. The vast majority, like on the order of 75 to 85%, are non-tribal jobs. The tribal government revenue that would be generated to support the development of the underdeveloped Wabanaki Nations would be on the order of $70 million, $68 million, we calculate. In addition, the federal government and the state government have money being left on the table, essentially, because of the impacts of MICSA in holding down the development of the Wabanaki Nations and their governments. So this whole state of Maine, when I said in one of my opening slides, this would be a win-win to remove these MICSA restrictions. This is what the win-win would mean. It would mean jobs for both tribal citizens and non-tribal citizens. It would mean income and GDP for tribal citizens and non-tribal citizens in Maine. And it would mean additional revenues for all of the governments, tribal, state, and federal, that operate in the state of Maine. So this is the reason we say that it is in the state of Maine's interest, not just the Wabanaki Nations, but the state of Maine's interest, to find a way to change these policies and remove these restrictions that are limiting the ability of the Wabanaki Nations to develop. There's kind of a saying in economics. These results aren't very surprising. The saying is, you're never very well off if your neighbors are not well off. You are not richer if your neighbors are poorer. Everyone stands to gain, Wabanakis and non-Wabanakis, from allowing the Wabanaki Nations to take advantage of the full powers of self-government that other tribes in the United States enjoy. So this is the bottom line, if you will, to our research. I'll end with just one quick slide. Because of the group that are assembled here today, working in the philanthropic sector. We work a great deal at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development with philanthropies, helping design, even design philanthropies, new 501c3s and their boards and everything, and we serve on boards and so forth. And just a few words about, okay, so you're hearing us talk, and maybe you're supportive of tribal sovereignty for the Wabanaki Nations in Maine. What does that mean? Well, the central message here, and this is actually as much an operational thing, as much a mindset as an operational thing, and that is, we find that effective philanthropy in Indian country understands and approaches the tribes, recognizing the centrality of this need to strengthen and build the capacities of tribal self-government. Because letting these communities run their own affairs has been the key to turning them around over the last 30 to 40 years. Philanthropies face great obstacles often, challenges in supporting governments, whether they're tribal governments or other governments. It's kind of weird for many of you, I'm sure. Wait a minute, philanthropy is give money to people. We're going to give money to governments? It is an area in which philanthropies are not very experienced. Some of the most effective philanthropies we work with across the United States in working with Indian country get it, that at this stage of the development of these tribes, it's important to support their development of their basic governmental capacity. But that's limited by the inexperience of philanthropies. You experience tribal political turnover, and we work with philanthropy. Oh, I got burned by a tribal government because they turned over the politicians, and we're never going to give money again to tribal governments. You have to have the patience to build capacity in these communities. If you don't do that, you end up perpetuating dependence. If it's really the philanthropy calling the shots, and you're not really developing the local self-governing powers of the tribal communities, you end up perpetuating the dependence, which has actually been so hurtful to tribal communities over much of the late 19th and most of the 20th century. What we do find is that strategies of work begin by recognizing individuals and tribal organizations in their official capacities. There's a famous line from the tribes like to use: we're not ethnic groups, we are governments. We are polities. It's important that tribes be assisted in investing in the institutions of nation building, and the language out in Indian country. The whole thing you're hearing about self-government goes under the flag of nation building. It's important to maximize the freedom through what we call issue limited block. Sure, you give money to environmental protection, but you want to implement performance rather than process monitoring and assessment. Did you achieve your objective? Not, did you spend the money exactly like you said? Did you hold the 3 public meetings? Look at outcomes rather than inputs. Look at performance rather than process. What we find is effective philanthropy gets that. It takes patience, but it recognizes that the key to the development of the tribal nations in the United States has been allowing those nations to make their own local decisions over their own local affairs. that in fact is not a very shocking message. It's a message that pertains to societies far beyond tribal societies. Local self-government improves accountability and allows local values to infect and affect the outcomes in those communities. And it's that local self-government that has been behind the boom that we're finally seeing in not only tribal economies, but tribal governments, tribal cultures, and overall tribal strengthening. With that, I will stop. I hope you have some questions, and happy to take your questions. I can't take them all, so maybe someone can monitor what's in the Q&As or whatever. If you have a way of raising your hands, I go ahead and do that. But anyway, I'll pause there and happy to take any questions or have any comments, good or bad.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, we have a lot of great questions and comments in the chat box. I just wanted to start, and I appreciate you sharing that last slide and maybe just taking a step back. We have a lot of nonprofits and funders who might be hearing about this issue for the first time and wondering why it matters. Could you share how tribal sovereignty and self-determination is connected to the work of nonprofits and philanthropy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually am I was chair of the board for 10 years now, and I'm vice chair. We finally find we now have a tribal member as chair. I'm the chair of a tribal 501c3 out in Arizona. And it's interesting. We're a path breaker because the nonprofit sector in the reservation communities has been very slow to develop. You don't find a lot of local nonprofits that a philanthropy, for example, can come directly and invest in. If any of you would like to invest in Arizona, our nonprofit in Arizona will take your money because we're doing some really cool things. But it's interesting. So often, you know, I'm on many nonprofit boards actually myself, even outside of Indian country. We like to deal with local nonprofits in our philanthropy. Okay, but they don't exist across the Indian country. And it's partly because we're not at that stage of development yet. The development of civil society, okay, is taking place largely in the form of local tribal government over the last 40 years. And that's one of the reasons many philanthropies have trouble and actually end up wasting their resources because they'll go in, we'll create a new nonprofit. The community isn't ready for it yet, because there's so much instability in tribal government because that capacity hasn't been built, that even the nonprofits have difficulty surviving. And so we're at a stage of development. It's much like many developing countries where until the local government gets its act together, everything falls apart. You can't hang on to a good language teacher and a language program. You can't hang on to a good home health care program, you know, because everything is in turmoil. That's the problem that tribes outside of the state of Maine have been solving more and more effectively. And the tribes in Maine are getting traction, but they've fallen behind because of the stunted tribal government development. So that's the kind of the problem that you face is a lack of a civil society, a fixed civil society world, if you will, on many reservations. And the need to begin by getting the local tribal government act together, if you will, and capacities built.
Great, thank you for that. We have a couple of questions that center around the fear of the unknown and what might happen, or what are some objections that you're hearing from folks who are skeptical or opponents from tribal sovereignty, and how might you respond to some of those fears?
The biggest fear that we hear is, if we have multiple governments with jurisdiction in this area, either geographic area or subject matter area, we'll have more conflict. And we actually have a lot of lessons in that, and we've actually written a great deal about this in our own research. The fear is, oh my gosh, we have now all these tribal governments will have their own zoning laws and their own land use laws and their own days of trash collection or whatever it might be. Okay, won't that lead to more conflict? First of all, people should recognize you already have conflict in Maine. That's why everyone is on this phone call, is because there's tension and conflict out there. What we find is the following. Yes, there are instances of conflict. We cannot deny that. But what we find is, in fact, as tribal governments develop and thicken up, if you will, increase their human and operational capacities, they come to the table of conflict more as equals and better able to solve problems. Often conflict arises because the losing party has to fight in certain ways. The weaker party often has to fight in certain ways. When you have equals at the table, what we find is, across the United States, hundreds and hundreds of intergovernmental agreements. And on the ground, improvements, not more conflict, but less conflict around transportation, water and sewer, trash collection, healthcare provision, on and on, law enforcement, and all kinds. And so I don't want to be a Pollyanna about that, in the sense that there is still conflict. There's conflict between Maine and the state of Vermont at the border, Maine and the state of New Hampshire at the border. And so there's conflicts, to be sure. But what we find is the greater capacity of tribal governments allows those conflicts to be solved, because ultimately everybody wants the same basic thing. They want good water and sewer. They want the trash collected. They want business development. And so what we find is that the conflicts tend to be reduced as tribal governments mature, and economic development takes place and allows those tribal governments to mature. Specific area, Jeanette, where we see this fear arises around environmental regulation in the state of Maine. And there, what we find is a similar pattern to what I've already described. Great fear initially. Oh my gosh, the tribes will have their own water quality standards, their own air quality standards, and so forth. We have actual cases elsewhere in the United States where, yes, tribe develops its own water quality regulations and begins to enforce them. But the tribe operates in under a regime of federal policies where you have to be consistent with federal policies. And what they end up doing is, what we find is, they're not out there trying to pick off, enemies and put in excessive regulation. They're working with the local communities to be rational, because everybody's ultimately wants the same thing. They want healthy communities where their kids are healthy, the economies are healthy, the environment is healthy. And so I don't want to be Pollyanna about it, but again, what we're finding is the maturation of tribal governments elsewhere in the United States is leading to something we see all over the United States. It's just intergovernmental agreements that solve our problems and allow us to get through day-to-day life.
Great, thank you for that. There's a lot of fear when there's power imbalance.
And I see a comment about CRITFIC, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. It's actually a great example of something that started out, if anyone wants to go Google on Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. I see Rebecca up there. I can't read your full last name, cut off, Rebecca. But a great example. Started out as conflict in the courts for decades. Now it's become a much healthier intergovernmental effort.
Great, thank you. I know there are a lot more questions, but I did want to invite Maureen Druin from Maine Conservation Voters and Morgan Hind from the Bingham program to just share a little bit, and we can get back to some more questions with you, Joe, in just a second, about how you all have engaged in supporting tribal sovereignty and what that might look like, so folks get some on-ramps on what they might think about doing in the future.
Great. Do you want me to go first, Morgan? Okay, great. So hi, everyone. I'm Maureen Druin. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with medium length dark brown hair, in my 40s, wearing a red sweater and silver reading glasses, and I have a painting of mountains in my background. I'm executive director of Maine Conservation Alliance and Maine Conservation Voters, two nonprofit organizations that protect Maine's environment and our democracy through education, collaboration, public policy, and advocacy. And Jeanette asked me to share a little bit about how my organization has gotten involved. And so I'm just going to speak about that very briefly. At the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, we were finishing up our 5-year strategic plans that, along with protecting the environment, ensuring a healthy democracy, and acting on climate change, we were deepening our commitment to racial justice and equity. And at the same time, a 2019 bipartisan task force from the legislature recommended 22 changes to the Maine Settlement Act that resulted in 2020 legislation that further recognizes the inherent sovereignty of the Wabanaki Nations. I'm really grateful to 2 of our staff members who raised this bill as something we should support, and basically said if we're serious about this commitment in our strategic plan to racial justice and equity, then we really should step up to support this bill. Our board of directors discussed the issue thoroughly. It was a great meeting, and decided unanimously that the organization should support the tribal sovereignty bill in the 2020 legislative session. But testifying on tribal sovereignty that year was just a first step in like a baby step on a much larger journey for our organization in learning about the painful history of colonization, where in just a few hundred years, the Wabanaki people lost 98% of their population, access to many of their lands and waters, and so much more. Early on in our journey, we were invited to become involved in the Wabanaki Alliance, which John Diefenbacher-Krall described at the beginning of the call. And the thing about the Wabanaki Alliance is that it's Indigenous led. And they have welcomed the partnership of many organizations like ours. And I see participants on this call, including Jeanette and others who are regulars for our Friday weekly coalition calls, to really create the momentum we need to pass significant policy. The Wabanaki Alliance leadership, the leadership of the Wabanaki Nations, they make the decisions on goals and strategy. And we don't speak for the tribes. And in fact, when journalists or legislators ask us what the Wabanaki Nations think, we ask them to ask those questions directly to the leadership of the tribal leadership of the Wabanaki Nations. But we do show up in partnership to use our skills and our resources to help advance the Wabanaki Alliance's legislative campaign for sovereignty. And a few ways we do this include lending staff time and support to the Wabanaki Alliance's campaign, especially on communications and lobbying. We ask our connections and networks to support sovereignty legislation. In two examples, I mentioned in 2020, we testified in favor of the bill. Only a few environmental organizations also showed up in support, but by 2021, the entire Environmental Priorities Coalition, which is a partnership of 37 organizations, said that this bill was going to be a priority. And in 2021, 2022, and this year in 2023, tribal sovereignty legislation is a priority of that coalition. We've also worked with Maine Votes, which is a broader progressive alliance that includes labor unions, women's health organizations, and economic justice organizations to step up, which they have. And you are all part of networks that you can use too. We have also asked our members and our email list to make direct financial contributions to the Wabanaki Alliance and other Indigenous-led organizations. There is a lot of fear about losing funding for your own organization if you ask your supporters to donate to something else, but we've really shifted our mindset from scarcity to abundance, which I think is reflective in what Dr. Kalt talked about in the larger concept of tribal sovereignty too. So that's been a really healthy step for our organization. And another thing that we do is we regularly feature Wabanaki leaders and topics on our Friday Lunch and Learn series. And Will Sedlak, my colleague, helped establish the Indian Law and History lecture with the University of Maine School of Law. And another effort I'll mention, mostly led by land trusts, is something called the First Light Learning Journey. And they really are focused on increasing Wabanaki access to traditional lands, including giving land directly back to the Wabanaki Nations. So I hope that our experience helps encourage you to think about like your resources and your networks and how you can access them to help advance this work. I would be happy to share more about our experience offline. And I know John Diefenbacher-Krall would be happy to talk with you about how to get more involved with the Wabanaki Alliance. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to share our story today, Jeanette.
Thanks, Maureen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan Hind. I am the director of the Bingham program. We are a small health foundation based out of Tufts Medical Center, actually. And although I am based in Maine, and our funding is used to promote health and advance medical care in Maine. And we have been an active foundation since 1932. So for Bingham, when we think about tribal sovereignty, we're really thinking about the long-term health outcomes of tribal members. And the way we approached it was thinking about things like life expectancy of tribal members, which we know from some older data that life expectancy is significantly younger than it is for the average population in Maine. And we also know that despite tribal health centers meeting all of the Healthy People 2020 goals over the last decade, they still had significantly poorer health outcomes in their communities than the rest of the general population. So there's something bigger going on than just meeting the health standards. And so we recognize that tribal sovereignty is an important part of that. And Dr. Kalt mentioned that the Choctaw life expectancy grew by 20 years over, I think, the last 40 years of economic development. So we see sovereignty as directly correlated with health outcomes. And so the way Bingham has supported sovereignty efforts is primarily through unrestricted grants made to the Wabanaki Alliance, which is something that is an option for many philanthropies that might be interested in supporting sovereignty. And so I think that the unrestricted aspect, it both allows philanthropies that might have some restrictions around lobbying. It allows them to make these grants without those IRS concerns. And unrestricted funding is sort of the gold standard of funding across nonprofits anyhow. And so it's a great way to support an organization, whether they're doing advocacy work or not. And then another way that we have supported tribal communities, we have funded grant writing capacity at the Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness Organization. And they just do incredible work, which I'm sure many people on this webinar are familiar with. So we're supporting their grant writing, and then we have supported other efforts in the past. A couple of grants we've made recently that I want to point out. A few years ago, there was a fire at the food bank at Zibayak Reservation, and that was arson. And we know that that was, I believe, racially motivated. If people can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's true. And so we supported efforts to help respond to that crisis. And then more recently, there was a flood in the health center at the Madakmaguk Health Center caused by frozen pipes. And it's created all kinds of havoc and limited access to healthcare for folks in those communities. And we've made a grant along with many other funders in the state to support that community with their access to healthcare and those needs as a result of that crisis. And I point those two things out because if we had stronger tribal governments that had all of the economic development available to them that Professor Kalt was talking about, those crises would not be nearly as significant, and they probably wouldn't require philanthropy to step in quite the way that we do. And I think we're all really happy to do that, and we're glad we have the resources to contribute to that. But I think we would much rather have tribes have tribal sovereignty and be able to support their communities with their own economic development, and for us to support that economic development. So those are just a few ways that Bingham has been supporting the tribal sovereignty and the tribes more broadly. And I know that a number of my colleagues and other philanthropies in the state are doing lots of really good work with tribal communities. This is just one small sample of what's happening. And if you want to know more about what's happening, I know that Jeanette and others at the Philanthropy Center can make that connection. So thanks so much.
Great, thank you. I know that Dr. Kalt has one question that he wanted to make sure to answer that he pinged in the chat, and then we'll be mindful of everyone's time and try and close right at noon. So back to you, Joe.
Well, there was an interesting question asked about the impacts of tribal self-government and all the attendant economic development on tribal cultures. And I just did want to say a word about that. I touched on a little bit in my little stories about Mississippi Choctaw and citizen Potawatomi nations. Where to begin? I'll tell a quick story. The Mississippi Choctaw tribe that I described, Smithsonian Magazine a number of years ago wrote a cover story about them. And this tribe that does the plastics manufacturing and all of that. And this tribe, the point of the Smithsonian article was basically, could you work in a plastic manufacturing factory, play golf on the weekends, and still be Choctaw? And I'll tell it by way of anecdote. I had the chief in that tribe, the head of state is referred to as chief. The chief of that tribe come speak at Harvard one time, and I had he was bragging about his economic development and so forth. And I had two of my Harvard students with no, stereotypes in their mind at all, raise their hand. Gentleman's name, Philip Martin, Chief Martin. What has all this economic development done to Choctaw culture? And buried in that was, some fairly profound questions, and scholars, researchers, professors, and so forth. We have filled up whole gymnasiums probably with books on that kind of question. What does all this economic development do to Native culture? And of course, that's a relevant question around the world for many societies. And the chief of the tribe, Chief Martin, thought for a long time, and then he gave the smartest answer I've ever heard. I should have given him a PhD right on the spot. I'll butcher the Mississippi drawl, but he said, I don't know. Everybody used to move away, and now people are coming home. That's all he said. The point of that story is this. What was he trying to convey? He was trying to convey, look, we're not about economic development. We're trying to hold our community together. We don't, in a certain level, we don't even care about the economic development, but it's the battlefield in which we are on now, and we need that development to hold our community together. It's one of the communities I mentioned where we see the data telling us there's language recovery. That language recovery is occurring not only because there's economic resources now to put into a language recovery program and other cultural programs, but it's also because tribal self-government and self-determination is restoring a sense of agency in these tribal communities. I'm not a professional social psychologist or social psychologist, but even the pop versions of that seem to convey to us that when do cultures, either individually or when do we get in trouble as individuals? It's when we lose our sense of agency. We feel like we have no control over our lives. And what tribal self-government and self-determination and the economic development are doing is restoring a sense of agency to communities that have long lost and had taken from them that sense of agency. At Mississippi Choctaw, everybody walks around with a little pin on their shirt that says tribal. Remember, I told you the vast majority of the employees are non-Choctaws, because all the Choctaws who want a job and have a job have already, they already have their jobs. Choctaws and non-Choctaws walk around there working for the tribe, and they have a button that says Mississippi Choctaw, sovereign and proud of it. In that very phrase, you hear that assertion of agency. And so when you see a community raise life expectancy 20 years in a period of only 15 years, it's because it's restoring culture in very deep sense, in the very deep sense of identity. The outer manifestations of culture may change and may not fit particularly the non-Indian society stereotype of what is Indian, okay? But if you can build a place where people can and want to live, if, I don't know, everybody used to move away and now they're coming home, you are watching the strengthening of identity and the strengthening of culture. That's a very short answer to a very profound question, and I don't want to imply that it's a complete answer, but it does give you, I think, the flavor of what we're seeing across Indian country as tribes restore that sense of agency, take control of their own affairs, and in the process of rebuilding their economies, rebuild their entire social structures.
I think that is such a beautiful way to end, Joe. Thank you so much for your time and for being so generous with us and those who could attend. I'm just going to put a slide on the screen to give folks some information on how to find out more about Maine Philanthropy Center. The Wabanaki Alliance will also share resources for folks to engage in, things that you've mentioned, copies of the report, and just so appreciative of your advocacy for the tribes in Maine and for sharing so beautifully about the importance of sovereignty.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much for having me.
Thank you.